Welcome to the design crew. So, my name's Christian, I'm an illustrator, and I wanted to talk about personal projects and just how to start. This is a personal project of a Hannya masked warrior that I designed, and it's the same process that I used to create the Girl in a Wolf illustration and the Eskimo character design illustration. So the first thing that we look at is research. So just anything that kind of sparks your imagination or your ideas. For this project, it was the Hannya mask in particular, used in Japanese culture, in theatre as a representation of a woman's grief or a woman's emotions as they started to darken and get worse, and usually triggered by a husband's infidelity. Another inspiration was Jangman Wall from Hotel de Luna, just the warrior who's been punished or bound to a place. And so I kind of took inspiration from that to feed into my character design. So I used that idea of grief and emotions, and I decided to mix both African culture and Japanese culture together. So you can see that I've used Pinterest. I use Pinterest to look at ideas, to look at clothing styles, and just as inspiration to work from as I come up with initial ideas, initial sketches. And you can use Pinterest to look for reference. You can also use Google. Studio Graphite also have really good reference poses, and Michael Hampton also has a really good book on how to draw anatomy, showing you how to break down different muscle groups into simple shapes and forms. The final two resources that I'll mention is Sketch Daily, which is really good for life drawing, and moderndayjames, who has a YouTube channel, also has a Gumroad site with some really good anatomy breakdown videos. The links to all these different reference material things will be in the description. These are all things that I've found helpful during my art journey in terms of learning how to draw anatomy or posing or shape design. So the first thing I'll do in terms of a project is do initial sketches, initial ideas. These are normally throwaway sketches or ideas. In this instance, I tried to sketch from silhouettes, but ended up giving up on it after a short while. When I'm sketching these, I'll be looking at the reference from the Pinterest boards. So in particular for this one, I was mostly looking at the Japanese culture reference board, looking at kimonos and the stereotypical look for a Japanese exorcist / warrior. And as I'm sketching, I'll look at the different elements that I like from different photos, and I'll sketch those in and try and combine different parts of different photos that I really enjoy, or even think about how I could change that shape or make that shape unique in some way. Some of the key tips to remember are to flip your canvas, so you don't just look at it from one way around, but you look at it from the other way around, and it can help you fix mistakes. Also, just to take breaks. After you sketch your first set of initial ideas, take a break, and you might actually see something different that you could do, or some part of a shape that you like, and maybe you don't like the rest of the character design, but you might like a specific part, so you might take that and attach it to something else that you've been doing, or that you want to do. So you might take, like that armor shoulder plate there and attach it to another figure, and that could be, the only thing you take from your initial ideas. So after the initial ideas, I'll take a break and I'll go back to sketching some more ideas. I might sketch from a whole different set of reference images to spark off imagination, or I might take like a small element of something that I've already done. In this case, I started to sketch from a bunch of different other reference images. I also tried doing just faces, because sometimes that has worked in the past, just to take a single face and then work on the rest of the body from there. In this instance, you can see I used one single part of the faces that I drew, and took it and continued to use it in further sketches. It was about here that I started moving over to more of like the African culture and influence, rather than looking at the Japanese culture as much. I'll sketch the specific parts of reference that I like. So even with this coat, I was trying to mix the Japanese culture having like a kimono over the top, but then also African culture by having the ab area exposed and having shorter and less clothes in the middle. You can see that I play around with a few different ideas, like having the mask iconography on the face as well. One of the main things I try to think about when I'm doing the sketching is just what was the original idea. So for this, it's a Hannya masked warrior that's stricken by grief, who has emotions that can change quite quickly from light to dark. And so while I'm sketching, I'll try and think about whether it is representing that or not. Is a strong female character still coming across? Does this female character look light-hearted and innocent? But also, do they look like they can manage themselves in a fight? These are the types of questions that I'll be asking myself as I sketch and as I go along, and asking yourself questions like that in terms of your character can really help you hone in on whether you have created something that goes back to your original idea and that resonates with your original idea, and it helps you determine whether you've been successful or not. In terms of cultural references, I was mostly looking at the African Himba tribe, and also trying to mix in, this kind of kimono language. And you can see that I've put that mini breastplate in there that I quite liked at the time, mostly just because it showed that she wasn't just a tribes person or tribeswoman, but also a warrior in some sense. So after this, I asked for feedback, and I actually got some really good feedback. I got feedback as to whether the character was being controlled by a Hannya spirit, or the character was somewhat in control of it. Whether I wanted to use lanterns for the character to carry souls, or whether it was some other type of object that could be less traditional. But I would always recommend getting people to give you feedback on your work, and even if they aren't artists, they may still have something valuable to say, so I wouldn't discount each thing that someone says. A really important thing is not to be precious about your work, mostly just because when you aren't precious about your work, you allow the space for feedback, but also you allow the space for growth, and that can really help you grow as an artist when receiving feedback from people that may be a lot better than you as an artist, and may even have really valid points to say, but you just need to be open to that feedback. That's also why people say don't be too precious with your sketches. So you can see here that I set up a perspective box. It's something that Ahmed Aldoori uses, but I am nowhere near as competent as he is when he uses this. But this kind of helped me break out of the mold of repeating the same design, and design some other different types of characters. As I said, if you struggle with any of this, the life drawing practice helps. Sketching from imagination, practicing drawing anatomy from Sketch Daily, learning the anatomy from Modern Day James. It really, really helps with this, so I'd recommend doing that first before you start a personal project, if you find that you're struggling with this. When I'm designing, I'll mix between sketching but then also just blocking out large chunks of black silhouette to indicate something. Doesn't always need to be too detailed, because you'll get to the detail further on. You can see that I played around with that whole tattoo idea, maybe having like a tattoo of the Hannya mask, or with some semblance to that. Yeah, like I really tried to play around with a bunch of different ideas, and kind of just get out of the comfort zone in terms of sketching. This was probably my favorite idea that I came up with, and I don't know, there's still something in this that I kind of miss from the final idea that I did, but yeah, this was probably my favorite idea out of the lot of them. And I also got some good feedback on this one, just in terms of black hairstyle, that I wouldn't have ever thought about that, but just that black people's natural hair is 4C, and this was from someone who isn't really an artist, but it was still useful feedback to make a character that's more relatable. So I ended up looking at 4C hairstyles rather than 4B and 4A hairstyles, which are more reminiscent of people who've had their hair done up to look pretty, rather than having it as something that's natural. This helps it be more relatable to a wider audience. One other important thing when designing characters is also considering shape design. So Kay and Kel talks about this, or Keenan Lafferty talks about this, but just consider having small, medium, and large shapes and balancing that out throughout the character that you're designing. And when you're doing posing, consider the S curve and C curve. So kind of just having a fluid line of motion, so you have a dynamic pose throughout the character and they don't look too stiff. That can help your characters look a bit more dynamic. So this is the painting of the final character. You can see that in terms of sketches, I really do use that curvature. I was looking at Studio Graphite for reference in terms of poses, also Pinterest, but I decided that the initial pose that I already had worked best. In terms of when I'm painting, I'll paint with like an undertone layer, which has the base colors just lightly put in there, with a bit of hue, but at this point it mostly just looks grey. Yeah, I'll build it up slowly like watercolors. So as the colors, I tried to pick like dark black colors to make her look a bit more menacing, but it was really hard to choose colors that might work. I found that quite difficult. But yeah, you can see that I'll build it up quite slowly, and things to think about, where your lighting is coming from. So in this scenario, it would be the top right corner, where the lighting is coming from, and I'll paint in shadows in the areas in which the light doesn't hit. Another thing to consider is that the eye isn't pure white. It's normally another colored type of light grey. Yeah, this is the painting. It's not really a quick process, it's quite a slow process. I'll also put in red on the cheeks, and next to the nose, and I'll do like red underneath or just above the eyelids, in between the eyebrow and the eyelids, to kind of create that curvature and that dip that goes on in the skull. But really learning how to draw anatomy helps the most for this, because those are the forms that you're communicating as you're painting a human being. So going back to the Modern Day James, the Michael Hampton books, also Ahmed Aldoori has a really good painting course that he's put up there now, and I think Sinix is really good for looking at how to paint anatomy, and not just standard anatomy, but stylized anatomy that you want to make interesting. Another thing that I forgot to mention was, well, you can see that in this scenario I use photos. As I'm designing characters, I'll photo bash. I won't always paint each and everything. But yeah, the specific thing I forgot to mention was the halfway to black technique. So on your color wheel, if you go halfway to black in terms of the color, but then you shift the hue to be more saturated, then you'll get a better type of shadow. You can always do like ambient occlusion with like an airsoft brush, pick a color. It could be bright ambient occlusion, it could be light ambient occlusion, and you just paint over the edge part of that shadow. You can see that I bring in Talia because in terms of this project, it was really just about improving the way I render. Most of my work always looks very, I guess, unfinished or unpolished. I don't really know the specific term for it, but it doesn't look as refined. So I kind of just tried to add Talia from League of Legends in there just to have like a standard of, okay, this is the quality of rendering that I'd like to get to. How far can I get? Not that, I decide to copy it because I'm creating my own character design, but just in terms of reference for the level of quality in the work. And you can see that I put in the shorts in there, which is part of a photo as well. Yeah, this is just the painting process, and I'll continue painting for quite a while until I get to a point where I feel like the character design is finished. And as you're painting, continue to bounce your eyes back and forth between your reference and your painting that you have, and also consider whether it represents the character that you initially started to try to represent. You can see that I'm kind of fixing the colors of things to try and help it to match. I'll look at different images of lighting to really get an idea of how my character should be lit. And you can see that it's kind of starting to come to life in some ways, and I've got the skulls at the side, kind of just to represent that, she is the sexorcist that's kind of connected to death in some way. Finally, I decided to change the elbow position and the shoulder position and kind of fix the hands. I'd look at the elements or the parts of a painting that you don't like or you don't think are working and focus on working on those. Make sure you continue to look at reference. And I start to change the pole or staff type of weapon to something that's a bit more straighter, so it looks like it's a bit more sturdy. It actually looks like it could be used as a weapon, because the other one kind of just looked like it was very flimsy and like it would break apart in an instant. Honestly, this section is mostly what I struggle with the most, just doing the front and back. You can see that I iterated across quite a lot and kind of redrew things to try and get what it should be quite often. And I think for me, in terms of what I might need to do, is just go back to anatomy and improve my anatomy. But yeah, doing personal projects will actually point that out for you, what you need to improve. So even with the weapon, I could improve material rendering, and actually make it look a bit more like metal. And you even spot differences or things even when you're working on your final thing, as to how you could improve. And so it's a good indicator to show where you're at within your art journey. So now I start to move on to thumbnails. In terms of thumbnails, it's always important to have really good reference. So as I said, Studio Graphite do amazing reference. Rachel Bradley also does some good reference, and stuff you can find from life drawing or Pinterest poses, or even like the specific Pinterest pictures that you were initially inspired by the most. You could use those, and it's important to have those as you go on to sketch out your thumbnails. So you can do some early thumbnails, which will be very quick rough idea sketches, and then you can refine those thumbnails, or 4 of them, into more specific ones that are targeted to communicating a story. I think whatever you're doing a thumbnail for, it's important to consider the main showpiece or the main element. So in this instance it's the character, so it will be how does the character fit into the frame, and then everything else in the background will be used to reinforce the story, retell the story, really just add to the character in the positional stance that they're in. And you can see that I do that within these quick thumbnails that I use to inform my final piece. Okay, so onto the final piece. When I'm creating the final illustration, a lot of the time I like to look at focal points, so you can see where I drew in those red circle dots. I'm thinking about the focal point. I also try and think about where is the lighting coming from? Where's our main lighting source? I'll use photo bashing as a quick way to get down an environment and have an idea of potentially what the environment behind the character would be. You can see that I use the same type of thing of laying in an undertone and slowly building it up. I really don't work too fast. Some of me works a bit faster than others, but I really don't work too fast. In terms of this, I tried to keep layers separate, so it was a whole different type of experience doing that and trying to keep the layers separate rather than having them together, because I want to animate this at some point. I think continuing to play around with colour and thinking about what colour might work with your image is important as well, and so you can see that I end up going through colours a fair amount. You can see I start to put in the bandana on the head. Honestly, looking at reference really helps. So I was looking at reference for this, and that really helped me communicate that form. And you can see I add photos in where I need to or where I want to. Not being afraid to add photos in as well. Doing concept art and illustration, it's not all painted all the time, and sometimes in the sake of having more time to do the painting, the photo can really help. And so you can see that I slowly build it up, and I'm thinking about where the arms are. I think for the arms for the arms, I took a photo of myself and kind of tried to pose in that way, as if I was swinging a weapon. And so taking photos of yourself and using that reference can really be beneficial. You can see I'm considering where the lighting's coming from, so I'm thinking that I'm gonna have something emit a green glow from the side. As I continue to paint, you can see I take off a specific section of the image, and so now we're down to a smaller frame. I tried to do like a spectral figure that could potentially be coming at this character. Initially, I had this idea of like creatures or something in the fog coming at her, and maybe it's like a ritual that's going on, and she's, discovered it, and she's come upon it. And you can see I go through many attempts of failing to draw anything substantial to attack the main character here. And this is why it's good to take breaks, because you won't always be able to come up with the best idea at first. And you can see I decide, okay, I'm scrapping what's in the background, let me repaint the environment behind, let me put in some new photos. You can see I took a cloth for the cloth that goes on the side of her, and instead of painting it out myself, I used the initial shape and painted over it. You can see here I decide, okay, maybe I can put a skull in and have some dark shadowy form that's kind of sweeping round, and always thinking about the composition. So right now I've kind of got it in an L shape where the action's taking place in a small box in the center of the image, and then you've got a wider L part where there's nothing going on. And so here I was considering, okay, maybe I can copy the type of circle that's going on on the ground and kind of have the eye go around the piece, maybe like that. And you can see at some point I decide to just scrap the whole idea, but it's the initial thing that actually started the painting part that was a bit more successful. You can see I tried to have like maybe the skull's gone and catapulted off the ground, and here's where I decide to kind of start scrapping that idea. But remembering not to be too destructive. Anything you sketch you might actually be able to use. So you can see I decide, okay, if it's not spiraling around the character and spiraling around the character gets in the way of showcasing the character, maybe I could have fog plumes come out of a pot and have it closer to the side. You can see it doesn't really develop quite quickly, but you can see that I just try to sketch it in. I think another thing is just considering shape. You can see I block out shapes to try and inform composition, thinking about how does it lead the eye back to the character. Where are my focal points? Where's the lighting coming from? You can see I add in the shadow at the bottom there. And honestly just playing around with it, and if you ever get too stuck, you can always look back to the original sketch you had at the bottom. Yeah, you can see I start to put a bit more yellow in there, and I was kind of thinking at this point, I'm not really too sure what it's supposed to be. I know we're in a cave, but it doesn't look too menacing at this point. Yeah, and you can see where I put that red triangle in. I'm considering focal points. So you've got the person's face, the skull that's closer to the top, and then I want to have something far down in the bottom right corner that leads the eye back to the person. You can see I just start to build it up slowly. There's no real rush to it. But as you improve and the better you get, the more you'll be able to understand what you're doing as you're doing it and make better design decisions. Yeah, and so I'm just adding the details and the things that were in the character design that I created initially, and you can see it doesn't look exactly like it. A lot of the time when I do the illustration, it never really looks exactly like the character that I blocked out or designed initially, but it's kind of like an improvement on top of that. Yeah, and so I'm just trying to get an idea of the space that is behind this character and make sense of it. I think it can often be discouraging when you're working through method of photo bashing and you're painting out these parts and trying to make sense of a really complicated set of photos that's all together. And there's like a middle phase when you're painting where it really doesn't make too much sense. But actually just having the knowledge that as you continue, as you progress, it will work out, it will get fleshed out, and you'll understand more of what you're doing. Yeah, is what you need to hold on to, because it really does work out in the end if you keep on painting, if you keep tackling those tough design decisions. And so you can see that in terms of having contrast, I decided to make like a mouth to the cave that not only creates contrast and frames the character, but also, you know, gives me a reason to have a lot more lighting. And so I start to add lighting to the character and add the rocks as well. You can see I'm trying to communicate that this environment is a place where a ritual is taking place, thinking about adding candles. It's always important to consider what your story is. What is the story? How can I reinforce the story? Not only with the pose and the expression that the character has and whatever surrounds them, whether it's a monster or an environment, but also what's in that environment. How has it been left? How has it been used? Ask yourself questions about the environment that you're designing, whether it fits in with the environment that you're designing or not. That's important to ask. You can see I don't always paint each thing. You can see I add rock textures to the ground to help make sense of it a bit more. And yes, I'll paint over it, but I don't paint each gritty part of rock in there. And so you can see I'm creating this fire, so now we've practically got 3 focal points: the face, the skull, and the fire. And so now I've got those in there. Now my job really is to actually work on fleshing those out and have them stand out so that the eye is led around the piece. Yeah, it was about here that I decided to edit and change the hair to something that kind of looked a bit more refined rather than just a bushy afro. And I tried to see it. What I initially wanted to do was have some type of Hannya mask on the character, and so you can see that I painted in that green thing, and I was also considering having like some type of summoning circle underneath, but I scrapped those ideas. But it's always important to consider playing and experimenting with ideas, even if you can't fully paint exactly what you want to do just yet. As long as you keep trying and you keep experimenting, you'll end up at a good result. You can see I kind of put in like a red dark layer to make the image more darker, but also to try and bring and highlight some ways that you can really make focal points known is just by putting a layer of another color on top. If you mute it down, mute the opacity down, and then if you rub out the areas which you want your focal points, that will help your focal points stand out compared to the rest of the image. That was a technical thing that I found from Ahmed Aldoori. You can see I try and play around with having a different type of background in the outside, but I decided that it wasn't really something that I wanted to do. And so you can see I'm starting to put things around the ground, so you can see the papers or scribbled notes, the book, the scrolls at the far corner in the left. We've got the pot, the fire. I start to sketch in the shorts. Yeah, honestly, if you do design a character and then you illustrate it, keep looking back to what the character initially was and keep thinking about how you initially wanted them to be represented, and ask yourself, does it match that? Because that will help you sell the idea of your character a lot more as an illustration to other people. Yeah, another thing that you can do is set up a black and white layer. You can put the color to black, paint a layer on top of full black, go into the layer modes, scroll down until you get to the black and white filter, and that can really help you look at where your focal points are, whether you have enough contrast in your image. If you're on Photoshop, something else you can do, you can go into the levels and pull the sliders of the levels around a bit more, and that can really help you see if you have enough white in your image and what it would look like if you had enough white in your image. And you can see here, although I couldn't paint that Hannya mask in, I got a photo and I managed to play around with the layer effects to have it look almost as if it's like a translucent mask, or as if like the skin has kind of been tattooed or warped in a way. And that kind of helped bring in this grimacing kind of image, as if, you know, the emotions were actually affecting the character. and I'm trying to communicate stories, so I start putting the faces of spirits or things in the fire, but that also helps it to be a focal point, so it's kind of hitting two birds with one stone. And so I think it's probably around here that I received some feedback. Where I was told to have the character actually look like they were fighting the skulls. So I decided to have her look as if she had just cut the fire. And as if she was in more of like a battle stance. You can see I struggled quite a lot with figuring out what that battle stance should look like. You can see that leg just looks really odd, and I'm not really understanding what to do with it. I guess this is still where I have a lot of ways to go, because if I initially set up a thumbnail image of something that worked, then I wouldn't have to do all this fixing and editing and experimenting of trying to find something that worked when I already had something that worked. So in your sketching phase, if you can sketch out something that really works and that looks really convincing, try not to lose that, and try to hold on to that, because that can really speed up the process when you don't have to do this type of editing. And you can see I'm really struggling with it, trying to think about how the body might look. And if you struggle with this when painting, go to the links in the description. Look at Sinix's videos, look at Ahmed Aldoori's videos, look at moderndayjames's videos. Do some practice studies from life drawing. Do some black and white stills of paintings, of life drawings from Sketch Daily. That will really help you. And even I still need to go back to that and improve my anatomy, because my anatomy really isn't there yet, as you can see. You can see I'm still going at it. If you do get to a point where you're really struggling, you can always take a break and come back. Never forget that, and keep remembering to flip the canvas. Flipping the canvas really helps. Get a fresh eye on what you're creating. And so you can see, still struggling with the legs, but finally kind of finding something that kind of works, that kind of creates this image of what I'm looking for in terms of a battle ready pose. Yeah, and you can see I decided to scrap those feet, mostly just because from the feedback it didn't look like she was actually fighting the skulls. And so now you can see I've got 3 different types of focal points. We got the face, the skull at the top, and the skulls at the bottom. And I'm still painting, still going at it. Yeah, and I tried to really communicate the muscle groups and forms in this one, because normally I don't do as much, and I kind of leave it very loose. So I figured that maybe this could be a time that I challenge myself. I'd consider ways in which you could challenge yourself in your illustration, and not just leave it to your comfort zone, and that will just help you grow as an artist. And so you can see I try and do, you can see I look back to the sketch and see, does it fit with the sketch? I try and do a bit more with the fire. Yeah, and I guess another thing is just considering the silhouette of each thing. So even the characters have the silhouette, and I try to, show that the fire is definitely being cut off, and have a bit more of a shinier blade that looks a bit more menacing. Another thing that you can use to show something's in motion is motion blur. You can blur out the image so it looks like, that object or thing is still in motion. And using the smudge tool, either it's smudge or the blending brush tool, and just going along things that you want to be blended out and not quite clear. You can do that to blend the skin of your character. You can use that to blend specific areas. So like with the fire, where it looks like it's wisping out, I've used the blending brush to blend the image. I think also just considering layer management, the better your foundation of the sketches and your layers are, the easier it actually is to work. Yeah, and you can constantly see I try and put in photos. So here, I was told that the spirits didn't really fully fit with the vibe that I had created on the left side, so I decided to change the spirits to skulls instead, so that they fit in with the image. Yeah, and you can see I play around with lighting, play around with the color to try and make them look somewhat similar. And so now the eye kind of bounces from the face to the left skull to the right skull. And now it's kind of, your eye is led through the action. And you can see I have it's not just having one focal point, you have other smaller focal points as well. So like the leg and everything arcs back into the character. Okay, so it was a long topic, or it's been a long video, and so if you want to see me break down any specific thing, whether it be the designing process and just do a walkthrough of live designing process, or if you want to see me go over anatomy or perspective or any type of thing in terms of drawing and painting, then I can do. Just let me know in the comments below. And in terms of the tutorials and the different things I mentioned that helped me learn art and helped me learn well, how to draw, how to paint, composition, how to be where I am today. I will put them below as links. Thank you for listening / watching. Yeah, hope to see you soon.